everyone. My name is Kate Fleming, and I'm the roster manager here at Mediate BC. I use she, her pronouns, and I am thrilled to be joining today from the traditional lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I have the pleasure today of being joined by our executive director, Sharon Sutherland. Hello, Sharon. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Kate. Thanks. And I'm just renaming myself, as you can tell, as I'm going. I'll note I also use she, her pronouns.
Awesome. So today we just wanted to have a brief little chat just about some of the common questions that we get from folks that are sort of curious about the mediation field and want to know a little bit more about what to expect. So I wanted to start with a really common question we get, which was
Mhm.
around certification. Can you speak a little bit to how someone becomes certified, or do they need to be certified, or what's the deal with certification?
Yeah, and it's really an interesting question because we get the question around, should I be certified? Should I be qualified? How do I do whatever that thing is that is tied to other professions, really? There's often you need a certificate. You get certified by joining a particular regulatory body. You participate in some particular way. And mediation is a really interesting field in as much as it's semi-regulated. So it doesn't really fit into any of those traditional categories. It is possible in British Columbia to be a mediator, to provide mediation services, and to have no training,
Mm.
nothing whatsoever, no certification, no indication from anyone else. It's not illegal to do that. It is possible. There are concerns in terms of how you would build practice. And of course, there will be concerns if you're undertaking particular types of work that might be unauthorized practice of law, for instance,
Mm.
drafting agreements at the end of it. But in essence, there's very little real regulation around mediation, period.
Mm.
But that's not true of particular areas of practice. And it's not necessarily true of what you need to do in order to get work as a mediator in most areas. So let me parse those a little bit.
Mm.
There are some regulations or legislation that will dictate who a mediator needs to be. For instance, family law mediators need to meet the qualifications under the family law regulations. And those will spell out things like being on Mediate BC's family roster, but it's also being on Family Mediation Canada's roster of mediators and qualifying there, being qualified under the Law Society, or alternatively, having particular training and experience qualifications that are spelled out within the regulation. So, yes, it's regulated. Yes, it matters if you're doing work in that particular area. And the same thing will apply in some other areas. If you're part of a specific roster under a tribunal, you will meet the regulations and the specifications of that roster. But to practice in general, the answer is no. And the reason you might want to nonetheless do something like qualify under as a registered roster mediator with Mediate BC is for the benefits of that credentialing, that indication that you've met the training criteria and the experience criteria, that you are subscribing to a particular standards of conduct, that you have a body that will actually intervene in the case of complaints or things of that nature. So it is a different question. If you are thinking of a particular area of practice, then you will want to check that area to see if there are any regulations, any legislation, any rules in relation to any of the bodies who participate normally, or if there are restrictions around the rosters. And the areas where you will definitely find them will be in family, will be in child protection, might be in workplace around collective agreements and what's specified in them, could be in legislation in a number of other areas. But you'll have to check each area separately. And we always encourage folks to actually call Kate, call me, call somebody at Mediate BC to talk about a specific area if you're trying to find that out and are not sure that you've found the right answer.
Great. Awesome. So, in that regard, because you mentioned quite a few different organizations,
Mhm.
are there particular organizations that someone should then be affiliated with, or does it depend on the area of practice?
Yeah, I'm going to say that depends hugely on the area of practice, and it also depends on your background. If you are trying to get into an area of practice where your own background and experience, maybe qualifications that you bring before you do training in mediation, give you the credibility and standing to be invited to do the mediations in those areas. For instance, in construction, an architecture background might be relevant in particular types of work. It may not matter to everybody within a particular organization that you also are a registered roster mediator with Mediate BC, or it might not matter that you're part of another organization. So those are decisions you'd make based on the subject matter area. But for instance, you can't be a child protection mediator in this province without being part of Mediate BC's registered roster mediator program, because those are the only mediators who can participate. So if that's the area you're interested in, you do need to be part of Mediate BC, and you do need to qualify as a registered roster mediator. The same will be true for other organizations for different types of referrals. And there's too many to go into in detail, but it really is going to be specific to each subject area that you might be practicing in and the ways in which it's regulated. It's very complex, and it really is. We do really do encourage folks to chat with us for the specific reason that your own specific area may have different regulations or different requirements than what we can say in a big general statement.
That's great. Yeah, and I love that we're having this conversation because it's really hard to capture all this, say, in an email, and talking it through can make a lot more sense. I know that there's a separate video from Mediate BC about Mediate BC's admissions criteria, so we won't get into that. But I did want to ask you if there's any additional training or experience that someone should be looking at, if, for instance, they're wanting to get into child protection mediation or workplace mediation, or even mediation that focuses on like a specific population or group.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's a really difficult question. I would say that most of these are quite complex. I'll answer for child protection mediation in a brief way, and I will also indicate that the child protection roster is specifically managed as part of a program by Mediate BC, which means that it's also it is a restricted list. It's closed to numbers. And we open it periodically to allow for folks in geographic areas that aren't well served, for populations that aren't well served, and it will be restricted. So getting the qualifications for being on the child protection roster doesn't mean you can become a child protection mediator. It is an application process to join a specific program. And I encourage you to reach out to our Director of Child Welfare for details at any time about what might be open or where there may be spaces where we are forming them on the roster. But for instance, in addition to having all of the mediation training that you would need and experience that you would need to be a registered roster mediator, in that particular program, you would also need to be able to demonstrate experience and knowledge working with Indigenous populations. You would need to have some context around child welfare, and that might be experience, it might be background. Some of that might be possible to be part of training that is provided once you're in the program, but coming in with some background or experience or knowledge around what child welfare looks like in the province is definitely a positive. Um, Family violence training for sure is required and knowledge around that. If you're doing family mediation, you probably already have the requirements around family violence. If you're doing other work, you may not, and you may need to pick that up. Um, and also understanding how to engage youth in mediations is another piece that would be an important part. There's a lot of training around engaging youth, and not just in this area, but in any area where youth might be involved. There is an increasing demand for mediators who have really good understanding of youth engagement, bringing youth voices into the mediation directly and indirectly, and how to work with youth as they participate in those ways. So that's a broader training area that people might want to look at. And there's another area that you mentioned a few other areas. One of the most flexible additional training pieces that we often recommend is doing work around trauma-informed practice. That would be important in child protection mediation. It's important in workplace mediation. It's important often in housing mediation. And it is something that helps quite considerably look at the ways in which you build processes to support folks who may be experiencing trauma, but maybe experiencing other challenges in participating. It's a really, really broad background piece. So something that can be very useful to improve your training and your mediation skills in a number of areas. I'll highlight that if there was one area that we get the most questions about from organizations that are seeking to build rosters, it's how do they find trauma-informed mediators? So it's something that comes up very, very frequently in a very wide range of contexts these days. And so I would include that. Human rights tribunal mediations, mediations where you're working with participants with mental health issues. There's a number of different areas that is going to be the key training area. So I'll throw that one out there, Kate.
Fantastic. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good to keep in mind, and especially for folks that are looking to get on a roster and looking for some additional training they can do in the meantime. That's good to look out for.
Yeah.
Shifting here just to our last question, which is a big one, but if you could touch briefly on your experience, you are a mediator as well as the executive director here, so you have some experience with the business side of mediation. If you wanted to just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, and I'll do it briefly because I think that there's other resources that will point folks to that are around detailed business of mediation
Right.
pieces. But I think it's really important for anybody who is thinking about being a mediator to recognize that there are not a lot of opportunities to be a full-time mediator as a job. That it typically people do not get hired to mediate through a specific program full-time or hired by an organization to be a mediator. It's not that there aren't some of those jobs, there are. And some people actually do start out their mediation practices in those kinds of positions, but it's infrequent and it's not likely to be most people's experience. So it is better to be planning and thinking about mediation as something that is a business and that is something that you really do need to have and expect to have marketing happening. So you're often trying to find the ways you engage. And marketing is not actually a dirty word in this context. It's not like how many times printing your business cards and glad handing and going around and trying to do things. That's not what I mean by marketing. Marketing is about ensuring folks know you're doing the work and that you're raising your credibility in a number of different ways, that you're meeting folks, that it may be attending different events and networking. It might be writing in trade journals. It might be doing a number of different things that you actually thoroughly enjoy that are simply raising your profile or people's awareness that you are a mediator in those contexts. It is really common for folks to get into mediation in one mediation and be successful and then start being called frequently by folks who were there, who are sharing your name, who are talking about it. That's often where a lot of your work comes from. But that first call is often about being seen to have expertise, knowledge, engagement in particular communities and particular areas. And I'll just say, Kate, I know you and I have had this conversation before. I think folks undervalue the things that aren't their business experience. They undervalue things like recognizing that all of that time they spent in community sports might mean that they're seen as being an expert in sports disputes, that they might be somebody that a community sports organization would love to have come in and do a mediation with a parent who is having problems with a coach. Like those are spaces that they can gain experience. It needn't be that they get hired by a national sport organization to do drugging mediations. You can start in other places where you have the experience. And that's true, not just sports is one example, but it's the kinds of places where people trust you and engage with you. Sometimes that has to do with community groups that you're members of. It's your experience with not for profits. It's your experience in the arts community. It's your experience in housing or your strata.
Mhm.
There are so many different places where you gain experience. And I think that everybody, as you're thinking about developing a practice, you want to think about where are those places people would trust you, engage you, and be happy to pull you in, feeling like you understand context. You don't have to understand details. You're not making recommendations as a mediator. You're not telling people what to do, but people need to be comfortable that they're not educating you on context from scratch.
Yeah.
And you asked a little bit about different populations and things. That's even more true where it's a population that feels vulnerable, marginalized, and has concerns that a mediator may not understand context, and they may be educating them. There may be a lot of emotional labor involved in educating a mediator who doesn't understand the context. And so think about those places where you already come in understanding context and can create a safe space. People don't need to spend their time explaining identity to you, explaining context, explaining other things.
Mm.
So those are all things to take into account for business. And I know that's, it doesn't touch on the various things that you need to do to set up an office or all of the rest of it. But I think it's really key for folks to recognize, yeah, it typically is a business, and you typically are looking for the work as
Mhm.
part of this role.
That's excellent. Yeah, I think that's a very hopeful and encouraging way to look at it is what networks and resources are already at your fingertips and just
Mhm.
shifting the way you're presenting yourself to those folks. Yeah,
Yeah,
fantastic. Well, thanks very much for your time today, Sharon. And for anyone that's got any follow-up questions, you can head to our website or send me an email. Thanks.
awesome. Thanks.
Bye.